This podcast is brought to you by the Islamic Center and NYU. For more information, visit our website at www.icnyu.org.
So I thought today we'd look at a particular short chapter of the Quran. It's called Surah Al-Ikhlas. Many of you probably either heard it recited or you have some familiarity with it. I've written it in Arabic on the board as well as transliterated. These are just other names for the surah that we'll talk about in a little bit. One of the things that was coming up quite often in discussions with people was a hope to have more clarity on like what does some of the things mean that we're typically hearing and reading. Sorry, the lighting here is really weird. And I look like a ghost on this. So don't mind me as I continue to talk. And so this chapter has a lot of depth to it and a lot of meaning to it. And we see it mentioned again and again in the hadith. But it's also one of those things that can create a challenge in that when you just recite it again and again, it becomes very mechanical and it doesn't necessarily kind of impact in the way that it potentially could. So I thought we'd go through it word by word, look at some of the meaning, some of what goes into kind of extrapolating meaning from it as a chapter, and then just have discussion on kind of how we relate to it. Does that sound okay? Yeah, great. So this is one of the shorter chapters in the Quran. It's typically known to us as Surah Al-Ikhlas. Does anybody know what this word means in Arabic, Ikhlas, or has cognates in other languages as well, Urdu, Hindi, probably Bangla. But the word itself, any thoughts? Purity, because it's written up there. Look at that. That's why you're a doctor and the rest of us are just posers. So in this now, there's kind of an opportunity for us to understand something structurally about the Quran. A lot of the chapters in the Quran, some were named by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Most were named by the companions of the Prophet. And what exists within it is an opportunity to understand just some of the relationship that they had with these chapters. The various names that they were to give was giving an indication that they had a deeper kind of connection to it. And in Arabic as a language, when you find a lot of nuance to meaning, it usually is rooted in a deeper connection to some kind of entity or object, right? There's like a dozen different ways to say love in Arabic, for example. But a lot of the nuance gets lost in translation because we just say love and we don't then really categorize it so definitively as they do in Arabic. There's like tons of different ways to say the word camel in Arabic, various forms of camels or different horses, for example. And so to build that connection in the names of things, we can in a bit look at what the different names were that the companions were giving to this, but more often we hear it as Surah Al-Ikhlas, right? A chapter that has to deal with sincerity, purity. Why do you think that's the name that it's given? So if we did like a rough translation of what this says, it says, Qul huwa Allahu ahad, that say he is Allah al-ahad, the one, Allahu samad, the Allah is self-sufficient. Lam yalid wa lam yulad, he was not born, nor does he beget children. Wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad, and there's nothing that's an equivalent to him. So what's the relationship here with sincerity, purity, and some of what this means? What I'd like you to do is maybe just talk to the people around you. As people are trickling in with the weather, and we can kind of hear from one another like what this kind of evokes within us from a meaning standpoint, and then we can come back and discuss. Does it make sense? Why is it called ikhlas? Why is it called purity or sincerity? And go ahead. So there's two types of verses in the Quran categorically. One of the ways we can break them down. Some verses are Meccan in nature and some are Medanese. And the distinction is not that some were revealed in Mecca as a city and some were revealed in Medina, but it utilizes a particular milestone in the 23 years of revelation as a distinguishing point. When people left Mecca and made hijrah, they migrated to Medina. And so if something's called a Meccan surah or a Meccan verse, it's essentially being referred to in the time period before people moved to Medina and established a community, a city, a state, a space now that was a little bit more safe in terms of practice. And something's categorically understood to be Medanese, where it is now revealed after that time. So you see a lot of characteristics of Meccan verses that essentially are now just speaking about God, the afterlife, oneness of God, a very pure monotheism. They're giving a sense of ethics, embrace of diversity. For example, you can see verses that refer to all of humanity, Ya ayyuhan nas, versus Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, that refer to people who practice Islam in specific. In Medina, you get verses now that are legalistic in its nature, the performance of certain practices, rituals that could not otherwise be done without the establishment of a space. So if you're living in Mecca and there's a lot of persecution, people are literally abusing you because you practice Islam. The early followers are individuals who come from the lowest social classes. They have the wrong skin color. They're not of the right lineage. They're not going to be told right from the beginning do's and don'ts. There's also a weaning process, right? So there's narrations in our tradition that say, if the first verse is revealed, said, do this, don't do that, nobody would have become Muslim. But the initial verses dealt with matters that made people's hearts tender. It softened people's hearts. It gave them an opportunity to really reflect and think. And you saw a lot that had to deal now with essentially the nature of who God was, right? This is a society, the Meccan society, that had conceptually the idea of an existence of a God that they named Allah. And it wasn't that it was a society that did not have a recognition of a divine entity or a multitude of divine entities. But there was now a narrowing down of what this meant in contrast to something that posited a pure monotheism theologically, as opposed to something that existed in the prism of atheism, agnosticism, or polytheism. You don't want to see this as a mechanism of looking down at somebody else's beliefs, but to start to now think more concretely, what does Islamic theology actually posit? Because when you attach yourself to a religion, the basis of it isn't, I'm Muslim because I pray 5 times a day, and that's what makes me distinct from somebody who's Christian or Buddhist or Hindu or Jewish or any religion. But what makes religion distinct from one another is fundamentally what the theology is, right? What does this thing base itself on in terms of belief? Foundational belief that makes somebody Muslim is what? What does like every Muslim believe? What do you think? So there's one God, right? So if somebody said, I'm Muslim, but I don't believe in God, or I'm Muslim, but I believe there's 2 gods or 5 gods or 10 gods, you're not being judgmental. Don't go to somebody and be like, there's something wrong with you. We're not talking about people in specific, but just broader understanding of abstract theology. One could say that doesn't fit into what Islamic theology posits. By definition, Islamic theology says there's one God and that's it. It also recognizes the finality of prophethood in the Prophet Muhammad. So if somebody says, I'm Muslim, but I don't believe in the prophethood of Muhammad, or I'm Muslim, but I believe that there was many prophets after the Prophet Muhammad, you could say, well, from a definition standpoint, that doesn't necessarily work. And then a third overarching theology that Muslims believe is in an afterlife, right? That there's something that this leads into. This is not it in and of itself definitively, but it's a means to something bigger. We're not the only religion that embraces some of these elements, but you can see putting all 3 together, it makes it distinct from other religions, right? So if somebody says, what's the difference between X religion and Y religion? You're going to look at it on a theological level. And the theology is then what informs practice, ritual. Because what's the point of this whole thing? Like, why do you pray? Why do you fast? Why did you engage in Ramadan? And you get to a place where it's not an identity variable, right? Which for a lot of us, when we grow up, we're given the ritual, the form, the do's and the don'ts, but we're not then given what goes at a deeper level. There's not a good or a bad here, but you want to think now. Like many of us in this room get to a place of educational aspiration that demonstrates we have critical thinking skills. But for whatever reason, it mutes itself when we get now to religion at the end of the day, right? Pedagogically, you've learned how to study, right? Two of you just told us you're software engineers. We got 2 doctors in the room. We have multiple grad students. We have people who they have demonstrated, not to feed anyone's head, all of you are beautiful people, right? I dropped out of 2 grad schools. I'm doing fine. Do you know what I mean? But understanding what it is that I'm talking about, you know how to learn. You know how to study. You know how to comprehend things. So this chapter, which many people memorize because it's short, but there's wisdom in that, you want to start to think deeper about it. What does this have to do with my relationship to my faith? Some of you have seen me use this example before, but fundamentally, when you look at Islam on a dimensional level, what we have are multiple facets that make our religion what it is. So you have Islam, that's the name of the religion, but then you also have the practice, the rituals, right? The do's and don'ts, the fiqh, your prayer, your charity, your fasting. That's what most of you get. That's what we get growing up if you're born into it. And if you convert, that's what people throw at you. Oh, you're Muslim now? Now you got to do like these 5,000 things. You're like, where's God in any of this? But so that dimension is one dimension, the dimension of ritual. And if we have that and we have that alone, regardless of what you have, when it's one dimensional, whatever you look at is just going to look like a straight line. Very simplistic. You can't do much with one dimension. That's all it's going to be, right? What our theology does then, this is my credit card. I will not show it on the live stream. What our theology does is then moves from one dimension that's just ritual, and it adds a second dimension, which is faith, theology, belief. Some of what we're talking about today. When you go from one dimension and you add a second dimension, it gives the line shape. So the line goes from being just something simplistic. I can only see you based off of your race or your skin color or how you dress or you don't dress. You are just one box that I see you as. And now it has more opportunity for meaning. The line can become a rectangle, can become a diamond. It can be a square. It could be a circle. And then what our tradition does is that it adds a third dimension that's called ihsan, which gives depth. People call it spirituality. You can call it a lot of different things. We're not talking about that tonight, but it brings now a third dimension that gives volume. It gives depth. That you can understand that I see this thing and you see it. None of you sees it the same way as anyone else, but none of us sees it better or worse. We're not wrong or right, right? And what the Prophet ﷺ was able to do was understand why he saw something the way he saw it, but could get why you saw it the way you saw it without having to become you. But it synergizes now these different dimensions. And then the fourth frame that our religion offers is time, that kind of encapsulates all of this in this realm of existence. So if all I have is this, I memorized the verse, but I didn't think about what does it mean to me? What is it giving to me? What am I drawing from it? That my 6-year-old and my 9-year-old, both of them, when they were like, my daughter started speaking when she was like 1.5, mashallah, right? She is like, I don't know what I'm going to do with her. My son, he started speaking a little bit later, but by the time both of them were 3, they had memorized this chapter. And I'm not saying that to boast about my children. I love them the way your parents love you, and you love your children and other young people in your life. My son, he would go down in his stroller. He'd be like spitting out these words. He'd be on the subway, screaming on the top of his lungs, Allahu Samad, right? People are getting freaked out on the train. It's okay. Then he's like in the bathtub. He's sitting on the toilet. He's spitting out these verses. I'm like, Kareem, man, some places you don't read Quran. He's 3. It's just coming to him rotely, regurgitating. Innately as a child, my children, a lot of young people, they don't have difficulty in understanding innately the existence of a God, right? It's remarkable. Now, though, to refine and identify what does that mean, that's like an ongoing exercise. So if you stop thinking about what this chapter meant when you were 6 and you memorized it, then you're missing out on a lot. Because there's hadith that say that this chapter is the equivalent in blessing of 1/3 of the Quran. It's got like deep impact. If you recite it 10 times a day, the hadith says Allah builds a palace for you in paradise. Our Prophet would recite it before he went to sleep. It's recommended to recite it after every fard prayer. And the Prophet prayed the 2 sunnahs of Fajr, the 2 rak'ahs that you pray before the 2 fard, the 2 sunnahs of Maghrib. When he would go on pilgrimage and pray the 2 rak'ahs for that, he would recite Surah Al-Kafirun and Surah Al-Ikhlas. In each of those rak'ahs, it was regular. Why? We pray it quite often, right? Surah Kawthar, Surah Ikhlas, right? Short surah, bang it out. You know what I mean? That's fine. It doesn't mean that there's not meaning to it. Then you take a pause to reflect. What does this mean? What this is going to give us insight on is that second dimension of our religion. It's about polishing now. What does Islamic theology claim? What does the Quran teach us about who God is? With an understanding that this is what this book is saying, to understand Allah in whatever capacity you can. Do you get what I mean? There's a concept now. So we talked about a couple of different things. I'm going to leave this here. Hopefully people can see and hear what I'm saying. I wrote a bunch of things here, but I'm going to write some more. So we have, like we talked about, some things that go into understanding the Quran from a Quranic science standpoint, right? So we talked about Meccan versus Medanese chapters, right? Verses of the Quran. This is said to be a Meccan surah, right? It's said, some people say that it was a surah that's Medanese, but most would say that this was a chapter that was a Meccan surah. These are verses that are Meccan, right? So they talk about the things we said, like God, his oneness, etc., kind of cultivating it in people. There's a concept that also exists when we're looking at Quranic sciences. It's called asbab and nuzul, right? Or sabab and nuzul. That some chapters, some verses, they have what's called a reason of revelation, right? So like nuzul means sending it down. Like we have in Surah Al-Qadr, Inna anzalnahu fi laylatul qadr, that the verses, were sent down on Laylatul Qadr. They're coming down. It's revelation. Sabab in Arabic is like the cause, right? So if you say the word because in Arabic, you say bisabab, right? So sabab and nuzul is the cause of revelation. So essentially what's happening in real time is that people are asking the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam questions because he's interjecting now theology that's distinct from the prevailing theology of the people of that time, right? So they're asking questions about who is God. So they say, Sif lana rabbuk, that give us an insight into the characteristics of your Rabb, your Lord, your God. And so they're asking questions, right? What's he about? What is he like? What is he made of? What are the things that create him in that sense. Again, this is not to knock anybody's belief, but you have to understand what's going on contextually to be able to then bring it to a place of, how do I relate to some of this? So they're coming, and all they can understand this through is the prism of their own theology, their own theological experience. So the Meccan society is a society now that has built its entire economy off of the practice of religion that embraces multiple deities. And in that system, there's now an understanding of many gods, that Allah, as a God that they have named, has children, daughters. The angels they deem to be the daughters of God. But they're asking these questions, and this chapter becomes a revelation in response to those questions, right? Who is your God, right? What is your God made of? What is your God created from? Like literally, right? What does your God eat? What does your God do? These are questions that they are asking. It's not an agitated interaction. There doesn't have to be this understanding that defines now a recognition of people who practice one religion and others only being able to go in a confrontational mode. And so when these questions are posed, the sabab an-nuzul for this chapter is that it's in response to these questions that are being asked. And to contextualize it, these are people who their intermediary between them and God involves now the form of worship that brings into the picture iconography, for example, right? So you see in various Christian traditions, the very deeply anthropomorphized understanding of God and a son of God that gives an indication that God is not just masculine in grammar, but very male gendered, Caucasian in race, right? We see that this is something that exists in Christianity. You can go to any church, there's a big statue of a white guy that is Jesus Christ, right? And so similarly now, 14 centuries ago, when this is happening, there's people who might not have that understanding of Christian theology, but they have it in terms of their own practice of religion. Here are the gods that we worship. These ones are made out of copper. These ones are made out of gold. What is the one that you worship made out of? What is the one that you engage? What do they do? How do they relate to others in that kind of divine system? And so you get verses that are revealed now that are in response to that. Does that make sense? So this first verse that comes, it says, "Qul huwallahu ahad," right? So the word "qul" means say, "huwa" means he, Allah is Allah, and ahad gets described quite often as the one. Grammatically, the word "qul" is like a singular person, right? If it was referring to a plural, like all of you say, it would say qulu. It wouldn't say qul. So qul is now being identified towards one person. And one would say, this is the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he is being told, people ask you this question, this is what you're going to tell them, right? But by extension, it's also there for us to take benefit from. The huwa in Arabic is really interesting here grammatically, because in Arabic, you can have this sentence without the word huwa. It's basically re-emphasizing, because you have Allah and then you also have huwa, right? So it would be like, where is Muggin sitting, right? And it would say, he, Muggin, is there, right? Why are we saying he and his name? Do you know what I mean? But the emphasis here in Arabic as a literary device is one that is of distinction and distinguishment. It gives what is called in Arabic shan, like you're giving a different sense of dignity and beautification to the divine. Allah is the proper name for God in Arabic. And there's a lot of different opinions on what is the root kind of derivation of the name Allah, right? Some of you probably heard this, that some people say this is the definitive and kind of combination of al-ilah, like the God, right? In Arabic, this is called ishtiqaq, that you are now kind of recognizing the derived root of a word. And so people would say that's what this is the root of, right? That you're rooting it in the word for God, ilah, like we say la ilaha, that there is no God, illa, except Allah. So al-ilah is Allah. And then some would say, no, that this is just a name by itself, Allah. And there's no elision, there's no root. And how they look at that grammatically is when you use the vocative in Arabic, you say, Ya Allah, and it's still maintaining that form of Allah. We're going to go through it pretty quickly in time, but the point of this verse that we want to emphasize is this word ahad, the one, right? What does the word ahad mean? Like if you were to think about it, because again, we want to think about it in terms of nuance. So when we're talking about Allah is ahad, it can't just mean like one chair, right? It's got to mean something else. What do you think this means, ahad? What are other words that sound similar to this that you've heard before? So why don't we do this? If you want to just talk to the people next to you, right? It's not a right or wrong answer, because you got to start to now be comfortable in starting to reflect and contemplate on things. You know, it's not that you don't go in with assumptions, but at the end of the day, you can't believe something just because somebody else believes it. You know, I can dress like you, right? I can eat the food you eat. Do you know what I mean? We can do certain things just because somebody else does it, but you can't believe something because somebody else believes it. Belief is in here. And so the words that we're reciting, they're meant to now serve as a mechanism of recognizing certain theological principles. What does it mean to you when this verse says that Allah is ahad, Allah is one? And then we'll start to break down what ahad means. So just talk to the person next to you and then we'll come back and discuss. Amazing. So Allah is also called al-wahid, the one. And one of the distinctions between al-wahid and al-ahad is just this. There's the one and then there's the only one. In Arabic, when you utilize the word ahad, it's not that ahad is only used to talk about God. Because there's hadith that use the word ahad. There's other Quranic verses that use the word ahad, right? La yu'minu ahadukum hatta yakuna ahabba alayhi, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says that not one of you will believe until, essentially you love me, right? But that construct is there. When you say la ahad, it's used now in a way to negate someone. There's no one, right? Or ahad is combined with something. Ahadukum, right? One of you, one from you. This is the only place in the Quran, but also the only place where you have like ahad used in this way, uniquely, standalone by itself. And now the people are asking the Prophet, like, what's the difference between your Allah and our Allah? And the Prophet is telling them that my God is ahad. Ahad in every sense of what it means to be the only one. There's no opposite of Allah. There's comparisons that can be made. You're not able to divide and build the only one. The way that you use the chair as an example. The chair can be broken into parts. My God cannot be broken down into things. Do you get what I mean? And you start to flesh out, well, what does this mean? Because la ilaha illallah essentially is like this chapter. And you start to think about the God that I'm connected to, the God that I have a relationship with, the God that I worship. Who is that God? And this is an important frame to understand. What are other names of God that you know of? Any? Ghani. Allah is Ghani, right? Meaning he's free of need, right? Self-sufficient. What else? Rahman, right? Allah is so compassionate, like the mercy is his prevailing characteristic. What else? Al-Wahhab, he's the giver, the bestower of gifts, right? So many divine names. We're taught, if all the trees in the world were pens, all the bodies of water were ink, you would exhaust them and still not write out all of the characteristics of the divine, right? Now think about what it means that Allah is Rahman or Ghani or Wahhab through the prism that he is Ahad. You don't understand them separate, but understand them together. Right? The Quranic verse says, "Laysa kamithlihi shay," that there's not anything that's like a likeness to him. So anything you conceptualize the divine to be, you understand that he is other than that. This is not a religion that anthropomorphizes God in any capacity. There is Allah, the creator, and he is distinct from creation. Does it make sense? And so Ahad becomes important, and it's hard for people to reconcile because it blows their mind, right? What are you talking about? That there are no others, but also there's like this uniqueness. It is a revolutionary idea in their society. One of the ways that people also think that this is a Meccan surah, there's a very well-known instance with Bilal radiallahu anhu. Who's Bilal ibn Rabah, the companion of the Prophet? What do we know about him? He was slave, he was tortured. What else? That's Zayd ibn Haritha. Yeah. Bilal ibn Rabah. Yeah, go ahead. He called the adhan. Great, right? What else? He's a black man, right? He's Abyssinian. He's like the only black person people know, right? There's a lot more, but everybody knows Bilal is an Abyssinian slave. He's a black man. So in terms of a Meccan society that's rooted in lineage, who your parents are, what your place in society is socially, Bilal ibn Rabah is not deemed to be from the upper echelons. Even when he calls the adhan, when they're now at the Fath al-Makkah, they come back and take Makkah in mercy. The Prophet says, get on top of that Kaaba, this thing that everybody reveres, and called the adhan. There's people who are not Muslim and people who are Muslim that are not comfortable with Bilal's blackness, right? But inna akramakum indallahi atqakum, that the most elevated amongst you is the one with the most consciousness. Literally, he's standing above everybody, right? The Prophet says he hears Bilal's footsteps in Jannah. Bilal radiallahu anhu, when he's getting persecuted by the Meccans, there's an instance where they strap him down to the Arabian desert. The sun is blazing upon him, and they take a boulder and they start to crush his chest with it, telling him to recant his belief in Allah. What does he say in response to them? Huh? He says something similar, yeah.
God is one. I don't know.
He says God is one. How does he say it in Arabic? Yeah. He says Ahadun Ahad, Ahadun Ahad, Allahu Ahad, right? Not only is he telling them that I'm not giving up on my belief, but this is what I believe. Allah is Ahad. It's one of the reasons why people say, like, this is happening in Mecca. He's being taught. He's giving insight. And then he knows how to respond to them. Because they're not saying, stop believing in Allah. They already say we have this God, we have many gods. They're saying, stop saying God is one. Stop saying that that one God is the God of everything. Stop saying that we all now fall into a relationship with that one God and we have equity and equality. And in the face of it, they're like throwing a boulder on this man's chest. Not only is he responding, but he's responding in a way that has real hikmah to it. They're telling him, stop your belief. And he's saying, my belief is ahadun ahad. It's what this says. Do you get what I'm saying? Does that make sense? What am I saying? Why are you nodding your head? Tell me why you're nodding your head when I'm asking you, what am I saying? This is important because Islam is a God-centric religion. And in a short chapter, Allah gives to us deep meaning that's rooted now in the foundations of understanding who the divine is, right? Why is it important to have a basic relationship with God that understands that there is not anything that's like a likeness to him? But when you're understanding God is the creator, God is the most gentle, God is the source of mercy, God is the most kind, God as the most just, but you understand him also as ahad. Why does that matter? Why is that important? Do you get what I mean? And you start to deepen in that relationship with an understanding of the divine by starting to now extrapolate meaning from this, right? So Allah is ahad. That means that, like, unique, the only one, like you said. But then you start to break it down even more, right? There's nobody's mercy that's like God's mercy. There's nobody's love that's like God's love. Nobody's providing for me the way God is providing for me. There's nothing that I should put my trust in other than God. La ilaha illallah. Allah is ahad. Nothing else is ahad. You understand? In place of it, now you contrast on a real level. What do I end up putting my reliance on then? Because fundamentally, I worship something at the end of the day, right? It's easy to stand and bow and prostrate, and you're doing that with your body, but it's much harder to bow and prostrate and kneel with your heart and to bring like your mind and organs of cognition into it. You see what I mean? So a lot of people worship money. A lot of people worship job titles. A lot of people worship external beauty. And there's gaps to these things. And you likely can contemplate your way to a place where you can understand, like where those gaps are, right? Ahad now is giving us an insight into who the divine is. The next verse says Allahu Samad. There's a distinction in the Arabic where Ahad doesn't have an alif lam in front of it. It doesn't say al-Ahad. It just says Ahad. But As-Samad has an alif lam in front of it. The grammar in Arabic is essentially denoting, like with a lot of emphasis, that Ahad, like, is Allah, right? Qul hu Allah Ahad. Like that's what the absence of the alif lam is intending. That like know this, right? And language is important. Do you know what I mean? And it's crazy. You don't want to lose your connection to language because you can pick up a phone. And I read an article the other day. I don't know why I was reading this. I got a surgery like right after Eid, and I was sleeping a lot and sitting and doing nothing and just trying to like rest and realizing how restless I can be when I feel like I'm not productive. I'm reading an article that the entire article is about people who use LOL in their text messages when they're not laughing, right? That was like the whole article. And at the end of it, I was like, what am I doing in my life right now? Why am I reading this thing? You can express yourself without expressing anything. And you can get stuck in a place where this thing becomes a tool and a vehicle that gives you deep insight into just how many emotions there are when you look at how many emojis there are. But it can also cause us to dilute certain things that are important. And the Quran has a lot of different vehicles through which it utilizes emphasis, right? Qul here is giving emphasis. Huwa here is giving emphasis, right? The absence of alif lam is giving emphasis. What it's saying is, know this, man. God is ahad. And you're just reading it again and again and again. What does that mean? How does it resonate within us? When we bring now Allahu Samad, right? Samad usually gives insight into like self-sufficient and all of this kind of stuff. Basically, what As-Samad denotes is that Allah is like your source of refuge. When people are asking, like, what is God made of? As-Samad is basically saying, like, Allah is whole, inside out. Like in Arabic, when you have a pure brick of gold, you'll use a word like that's rooted in samada, right? There's nothing there. It's just whole. You know what I mean? So like Allah is not made of anything. There's not things that are like kind of deficiencies or inadequacies there. But you now have a refuge in God because God doesn't change. God is consistent. So you start to understand God's rahmah. You understand God as being Wahhab, Latif, Rahim, all of his divine names through these two names, Ahad and Samad. Allah is the eternal refuge. He's the one you want to go to when you're in need. So you have hadith that say that Allah wants you to ask of him. Hadith that say God comes down in the last third of the night to see who's calling upon him. You have verses and tradition that give indication again and again and again that the one that you want to turn to is Allah. You have a need. Like literally, it teaches us. Even if you break the strap on your sandal, you turn to God for assistance. So in all matters, all needs, it doesn't mean you don't utilize the means. You engage, you exert, but you understand that the one who's going to free you of your needs is the one who's free of all needs. This is what as-samad means. There's a tool in the Quran where you see attributes of the divine paired together. Al-Ghani wal-Kareem, right? Allah is free of need and he's Kareem, he's generous. Allah is Al-Hayyum wal-Qayyum, right? The living, the self-sustaining. And so you have Al-Ahad, As-Samad follows a similar pattern that the first attribute, Al-Ghani, is giving an indication of who God is. And the second attribute, Kareem, is giving an indication of how he relates to his creation. You see? So Ahad is teaching you about who Allah is, and Samad is teaching you how you engage Al-Ahad. So there's verses in the second verse, the Mufassirin, some would say that Allahu Samad is just an explanation of Huwa Ahad. Right? That's one opinion on the purpose of this verse, the meaning of it. It's tafsir. A second opinion says that it's in response to the questions that the Prophet is being asked. So they're asking questions and Allah is telling him, tell him that God is Samad, right? That God is not built the way that your gods or your conceptualization of God is. Do you get what I mean? What does this make you think about in your own relationship, your own kind of consciousness and awareness of the divine so far? Great. Now think about this in the context of other divine names, right? So we talked about Ahad. You're talking about As-Samad, right? The one that you're turning to. Allah is Al-Mujib. He's the one that answers your prayers, right? Allah is Al-Basir. He's the one that sees everything. He's Al-Alim. He's the one that knows everything, right? You start to understand and deepen in recognition through different names and see how they relate and connect to one another. And it's not meant to be like a hard task. You know what I mean? Because everything you have as a tool is given to you. You just got to sit down and feel empowered to pick up the book and just use the head that you were given to like sit and think, what does this mean? How does it connect? Grab a buddy and talk to them. But you start to now find empowerment. The Prophet ﷺ goes to Taif before Medina comes into the picture, right? Taif is hell for the Prophet. His wife asks him, what's the hardest day in your life? And he says, Taif. Taif was hard. He doesn't say we don't complain, there's no problems, right? They go through a lot of persecution, a lot of difficulty. He's trying to find a place where the people who are following him, who he's telling them, follow this message, there's benefit in it for you. But they're getting boycotted, abused, beaten, killed. We just talked about a man who had a boulder thrown on his chest. Like, there's no consequences to people. He's trying to find a safe space for them to be. He goes to Taif thinking that people will welcome him in. He's in a place where the opposite happens. The chieftains command the children and servants of the tribes to run him out. He's abused. We have narrations that say like excessive blood is flowing from his feet. His sandals get stuck to his feet because of the amount of blood that's coming out of it. He leaves from the town distraught, in a state of just disarray. And the first thing he does is he turns to Allah, right? And I want you to think about this in the context of Allah being as-Samad. The Prophet is turning in a moment of difficulty, but it's heightened because he also turns in moments that are not difficult. So embracing the notion that Allah is as-Samad is not just, man, I didn't get that job. Somebody passed away. I'm grieving. It's hard for me to figure out relationships. It's hard for me to know how to exist in this world. This is hard. That's hard. But when things are good, you still turn to as-Samad. You start to recognize that if I'm only turning in a moment of difficulty, am I turning in entirety from where the gain is for me? Because Allah is Ahad, that means that Allah does not benefit from you turning to him. Because Allah is Samad, Allah also is not benefiting from you turning to him, right? The gain is for who to turn to God. And that's not a question that's being answered with a supposed to answer. You don't want to just talk your way into a relationship with Allah. You start to bring yourself to a place that's like, why did I stand? Many of us in this room, we spent at least one night together a few weeks ago from the middle of the night till the sun rose, just like in prayer. Why? You get what I mean? My 6-year-old left the building in tears. Baba, I want to do Qiyam with you. And I'm like, Kareem, man, what? You don't even know what Qiyam means, bro. Like, what are you talking about? You want to stay here because all these people think you're cute and they keep giving you cookies and snacks and all kinds of baked stuff. That's why you want to stay here. And he's like, Baba, I don't want to go home, right? Why did you stay? And it's not that there's not meaning to it. There is meaning to it. Don't start with a negative frame. You start with a positive frame. Yeah, there's benefit to it. Think about how that can be enhanced. And all we've done is look at a few words in a chapter that most of us recite again and again and again. Do you know what I mean? So what if you stood in that qiyam and you were like, Allah is an ahad. Allah is as-Samad. And Allah is my Lord, my Rabb, my God. These are not abstract conversations that I'm having or academic, but I'm embracing them. And I start to conceptualize my relationship with my Creator as one who I fully believe is these things. And even beyond it, because it's just giving me an insight based off of my limited capacity to fathom. Do you get what I mean? What I love for us to do for 2 minutes right now is just turn again to the people sitting with you. What are you taking away so far, right? If you just walked in, it's okay. Just find somebody else who's been sitting here. But what are some of the things that it's eliciting for you, right? Whether in your own kind of socialization, you want to pay attention to what comes up. Feelings of discomfort, feelings of relief, feelings of whatever it is. You don't have to name them, but in a space like this, it's not just about front-facing lecture. We don't want to regurgitate the same problem. That somebody is telling you what to think, right? But you can embrace now your God-given capacity to choose what you think about and how you think about the things that you think about. And then we benefit from everybody's perspectives. You get what I mean? So be comfortable. Don't be the only one talking. Let others talk. But also that means don't be quiet. What are you taking away so far? And then we'll come back and discuss. Yeah? Okay. Yeah, and this is important to flesh out, right? Because here now we have Tawheed, we have oneness in terms of God. So Islamic theology doesn't tolerate bringing anything into partnership with God. That includes like my own self, right? To elevate myself to a place where I believe I am like the source of accomplishment. I am, the provider of my children and my wife. No, God is their provider, right? I can be the means through something, but a recognition of like, what does the theology actually break itself down to? And what does it mean? Like this word of shirk, right? Like to bring people in to partnership, right? Like, and that's what it's fundamentally rooted. I don't know if any of you have like a Islamic finance mortgage or know people who do. Like if you open a mortgage with Guidance Residential, the model that they use is called musharaka, right? It's a partnership, right? It's got the same root, shirk, so that's what you're essentially doing. You're bringing people into a place. You're bringing other things in. And when these guys are asking the Prophet, like, who is your God, right? Siflana Rabbuk, like, tell us the sifat, the descriptions, the characteristics of your God. He says, Ahad, Samad, right? There's nothing at the level of the divine. Allah is unique. Allah is the only. Allah is in every facet, in every aspect. Allah is Samad. He is unaffected, unchanged, eternal in all of his existence. And this is where like that becomes critical to understand, because that La ilaha illallah, it follows this formula of ultimate negation and then absolute affirmation. La ilaha, there's no God. Illa, except Allah. That's it. So it necessitates removing everything else to then create what is then deemed to be mukhlis. So like, who are you doing what you do the things you do for? Right? It doesn't mean that you can't bring distinct elements to it, because we have narrations in our tradition that say, تَخَلَّقُوا بِأَخْلَاقِ اللَّهِ, that you want to embody the characteristics of the divine that you're able to. So the idea is that God is good, you want to be good, so then be what you can of what we know God to be, because that's good. So God is good and God is merciful, so be merciful, because God is good and being merciful is good, being like God. Does that make sense? So Allah is Samad. You turn to Allah because He is As-Samad, the eternal refuge, the one you turn to in times of need. So how do you actualize this? Somebody turns to you in need, don't push them away. You get what I mean? And you do it with a recognition of like, this is what goodness is. And you don't ponder with self-deprecation, but you ponder with productive introspection. Why does nobody turn to me? You get what I mean? And when someone's coming who's in need, what does somebody need to look like for me to not be there for them? what color of their skin, what social class, what part of the world, what faith, what religion, what anything. When we say Allah is Ahad and Allah is Samad, and He is one God of all creation, that doesn't mean that He is Ahad just for Muslims. It doesn't mean that He is Samad just for people of Iman. It doesn't mean that He is Al-Mujib just because you make dua to Him in Ramadan. Allah is the creator of everything. A God-centric religion that centers now an orbit of interaction, of diversity in all of its forms, necessitates understanding that people will turn to you. You don't want to push them away or like not even acknowledge and pretend like they're not there, because in your consciousness they don't exist, because you're only looking to people that look like you or from the same places as you. You see what I mean? And it's a different variation of this self-talk that's like, I did that. No, man, like God did it. And you relate to God. And you recognize how God relates to you. There's a paradox in our theology that in divine decree, absolutely, there is human agency. So you choose, you act, you decide. And the mukhlis necessitates bringing it back to this. Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahu samad. That's what it comes down to all the time. And if it's not coming back to that, then there's an absence of ikhlas. Because that's not la ilaha illallah if you're bringing something else now in partnership. You see what I mean? It's hard to at times be able to bring ourselves out of a negative cognitive bias. So you have to engage in what's called remembrance, dhikr. It's not just sitting down and pulling off beads and then just on your tongue saying Allah, Allah, Allah. But you take a pause from the kind of monotony of the world and you bring into your place a sense of, what is this all about? Who am I doing it for? Who is God to me? Otherwise, it's going to be just that simplistic perspective that we talked about in the beginning of this discussion. You're going to just see it through one dimension, the prism of just practice, and everything then is going to be absent of feeling empowered and connected. You get what I'm saying? And so it's giving you the recipe. This is what it's about. You want something to be pure? Don't do it for anything other than Allah. Because Allah looks for a reason to accept from you, not for a reason to push you away. How many people in this garbage world look for a reason to judge you and tell you why you're not good? Point out constantly what's wrong with you. They won't hire you, but they'll hire somebody else who looks like them. Even though you're more qualified than the other person, they'll pay you less because you're not the gender that gets paid more. They can sit and intellectualize in conversations and debates how practically your life will play out day in and day out. It's crazy. You get what I'm saying? So why do you do anything for them? Not in the sense of helping and assistance, but in pursuit of their validation. Why are you doing it in pursuit of what somebody else thinks? I walked here today. I don't know where my umbrella is. Is it here somewhere? I got a dinosaur umbrella with me right now. Maybe somebody took it. I don't know. It's my son's. I didn't have an umbrella. It's raining outside. And somebody is staring at me on the bus. They're staring at me. It's like, whoa, you have a nice umbrella, man. Like, thanks. You know, I hope you enjoy the munchies later, right? I need to protect myself from the rain. Am I going to be foolish and be like, oh my God, what will people think? I have dinosaurs on my umbrella. Nobody cares about me. Nobody's looking at me as much as I think that they are. It doesn't mean I'm insignificant. Al-Ahad still hears my prayers the way everybody else's prayers are heard. But it's not about what you're chasing after for the most part. And you're stuck in a prison in your head that starts to seep into your heart because you're trying to gain validation from what at the end of the day? So it doesn't become less difficult, but it adds a different prism. Why am I doing what I do? What am I in pursuit of? You get what I mean? Lam yalid wa lam yulad. Lam grammatically gives an automatic insight that this is something that was accomplished already, completed, a past tense, right? So Allah is not born. He was not begotten, right? It makes sense because Allah's existence then will refer to something that has already taken place. Lam yulad, that he also, in the same past tense, does not bear children, right? There's a lot of different things that go there, but from the standpoint of now recognizing what our theology is built on, our theology of God in Islam is built off of a negative knowledge. It's about knowing what God is not. Because of that verse, Laysa kamithlihi shay, there's not anything that's like a likeness to him. And so we're now recognizing the fundamental aspects of what makes Allah, Allah. So here now you have this in response again. These are people that are sitting and saying, my God has children, my God has this. It creates limitations that the Prophet is now giving response and answer to. That says, here now we have one God, and this is a recognition that there's not an opportunity to be able to create competition. There's not an ability to say that there is multiplicity to power and knowledge and knowing in these ways across numerous entities. Look at the way the world functions. You have superpowers that are constantly in combat with each other, right? People exist at levels of equivalency in terms of what they harness. What does our media tell us about different countries in the world that we don't ally with? What do those countries? You want to see like funny tweets? Go look at the way Chinese politicians respond to American politicians. When these like right-wing Republicans are talking about America's greatness and these Chinese politicians respond, what's making you great? That you are killing Black people in your streets? That since the beginning of this year, you have had close to 200 mass shootings? That there are people dying in your streets that don't have health care? Do you get what I mean? Don't think about it from the standpoint of what you see or what you're fed in your educational institutions. See what other people think about this country and vice versa, but they're in competition. They're not sitting in a place of peace. You're powerful, I'm powerful, great. But entire nation states that now embody a sense of capacity just by itself creates conflict, creates agitation, creates war. Lam yalid wa lam yulad. There's nobody that's a partner of the divine. There's nobody that has the ability to compete. There's nobody that can create a struggle or these kinds of things. One God, that's it. Some of the mufassirin say it's miraculous that after this verse is revealed, there's no religion that comes into existence that then claims God has a child. That everything that's there predates Islam's advent. But post-Islam, religions come into existence. Scientology is not claiming certain things, right? Rastafarianism is not claiming certain things. We're not judging people on their faith, but it's understood that this exists in the past tense. And one could challenge it, but there's not that challenge. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. These last two we look at just a little bit quicker in the interest of time. Grammatically, this verse, the last one, is not written the way one would speak Arabic. Because the subject, ahad, is at the end of the sentence. If you were to read it in its actual Arabic, it would say, وَلَمْ يَكُنْ أَحَدٌ كُفُوًا لَهُ. Does it make sense? So here now, the verse, say again, وَلَمْ يَكُنْ أَحَدٌ كُفُوًا لَهُ. The lahu would come at the end instead of at the beginning. Ahadun would shift to the front, right? It's the subject of the sentence. The lahu refers to Allah. And so part of Allah being ahad, part of Allah being as-samad, is that he's also then what comes first. There's a certain elevation and majesty to the divine, right? So the verse in and of itself would become absent of indicating what this chapter is referring to if it moved God to the end as opposed to the beginning. You see what I mean? Kufu in Arabic means like an equivalent, right? So when people get married, they're told, for example, marry somebody who's compatible to you. They'll use this verse, right? This word. You know, in books of fiqh, it'll talk about that. Compatibility, right? Someone who's your equal in a certain way, right? Because there's got to be compatibility there in some capacity. Equivalency is not just about shared culture and shared class or whatever else. You know what I mean? Like you could be from totally different backgrounds and still have compatibility. You also have this word used when somebody's talking about like an opponent that you're taking on in maybe one-on-one combat. Like you're equal in that sense. Do you know? So here the verse is saying there's nothing that is like an equivalent of the divine. There's not anything that's like Allah. And it's giving us now 4 foundational elements to understanding like God's oneness. He is Ahad, he is Samad, not born into the world, not born into existence, nor does he bear into existence. And there's not anything that's like God, equivalent or otherwise. You see? And you're reading this multiple times a day, again and again and again. But you read it now as a prism of strength, right? Where do you draw your strength from? The check that you write me. Where do you draw your strength from? The way that you tell me I'm beautiful when I dress the way you tell me. Where do you draw your strength from? The fact that I look like the person on the billboard. Where do you draw your strength from? I draw it from the source of all strength. I draw it from an entity that believes in me more than I believe in myself. An entity that loves me more than a mother loves its child. More than I even love me, God loves me. One whose love is unmatched by anything else that loves. One whose mercy, one whose compassion, one whose gentleness. Because he is Ahad. So just like Bilal, when it gets tough, recount your faith, Ahadun Ahad. You're not going to be what gets me through this. The one, the only one. That's who it is that I believe in. You see what I'm saying? It's a chapter that's meant to inculcate strength, not make you walk on eggshells. It's meant to give you an insight on who it is that Islam says you should be in worship of and what you worship. You see what I mean? I want to just share a few hadith that can give us some insight. There's about 5 minutes before Maghrib comes in. There's a bunch of names that the companions had, which I thought was interesting. I wrote down a lot here. Probably can't read it because my handwriting is terrible, right? But this chapter is called Al-Ikhlas, like we talked about. It's called At-Tafreed, the unique. At-Tajreed, it's something that's free of anything else. At-Tawheed, just the word for Islamic monotheism. It's called An-Najah, the salvation. Al-Wilaya, the protection. An-Nisba, like the connection to Allah. Al-Ma'rifah, the knowledge of Allah. Ma'rifah is like an intimate knowledge, right? It's not like ilm 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's ilm. Fahm is if you understand something. So if somebody said, do you get this? 2 plus 2 equals 4. You could say, fahamtu, I got it, right? Afham, I understand, I comprehend. Ma'rifa is like intimate knowledge, right? The verse says, we were made into nations and tribes, li ta'arafu, so that you know one another, right? Acquaintanceship. So ma'rifa is like knowing God in that way intimately. You know, you develop an actual relationship. Al-Jamal, the beauty. Al-Muqashqasha, the cure. Al-Mu'awwidha, the refuge. It's called As-Samad, the surah that is about the one who is eternally besought, right? Taking it from the second verse. Al-Asas, the foundation. That this is what you build your religion on. And many more that are there. There's a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said that say he is Allah the one, meaning Qul huwa Allahu ahad, is equal to 1/3 of the Quran. And the Prophet would recite these 2 surahs. So in Surah Al-Kafirun is 1/4 of the Quran. The Prophet would recite these 2 surahs in his bowings before the dawn prayer, meaning his 2 sunnah prayers before the Fard al-Fajr. He'd recite Surah Al-Kafirun and Surah Al-Ikhlas. And those 2 sunnahs are said to be in reward and ajr worth the entire world and everything in it. So why is he reciting these 2 things regularly, consistently, right? Building a relationship with it. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, a man said, O Messenger of Allah, I love this chapter, Qul huwa Allahu ahad. The messenger said, your love for it will admit you into paradise. A man heard another man reciting Qul huwa Allahu ahad over and over. So the next morning he came to the messenger of Allah and told him about it as if he thought it was not enough to recite. And the messenger of Allah said, by him in whose hand is my soul, indeed it is equal to 1/3 of the Quran. Why it's said to be 1/3 of the Quran is that when you divide the Quran into subsections, 1/3 is said to discuss Allah, his names, his attributes, right? And so this is essentially encompassing that category in its fullest. In another hadith, whoever recites the chapter 10 times completely, then Allah will build a palace for him in paradise. And many other hadith recited after the Fard prayer. So Ayatul Kursi and Surah Al-Ikhlas after your Fard prayers. Before you go to sleep, the Prophet ﷺ would recite Surah Ikhlas, Surah Al-Falaq, Surah Al-Nas. He would then blow into his hands and rub those hands around him as a protection for the night, right? There's numerous instances. A man was put in the position of leading the prayer, and he would always recite this chapter, then recite others. And the companions would get frustrated and say, why are you doing this? And they said to the Prophet, he does this thing. He said, go ask him and tell him I'm asking why. He says, I love this chapter. I love this surah. And when they tell the Prophet that, the Prophet says, like, tell him it's like his means to paradise, right? That his love for it. Why do they love this chapter? Do you know what I mean? And I'm saying this to you because when I read these hadith growing up, like, I didn't feel empowered by God. I felt like everything I did was wrong and everything was haram and everything was just always black and white. And I read these things and it's like, man, I read this chapter constantly. Why is it not making me feel more love? The idea is not about just the recitation of it. You got to like reflect on it and contemplate upon it and then build belief through it and conviction. What does it mean to you that Allah is ahad? What does it mean to you that Allah is as-samad? It can't just be, well, it means to the guy next to me this, so that's what it is. It's not meant to be Sunday school knowledge. It's not about, let me just spit out facts. I'm going to give a khutbah or a halakah. This is about a philosophy on life. And then you are then implementing it. But this part of it, conviction, belief is inward. So it's not just read the book, but you nuance perspective by reading, listening, contemplating, and then you reflect on it. Like, what does it mean to me? How do I like start to love a chapter of the Quran? And I love it not because it's recitation or I recite it well, but I love it because of what it's telling me and teaching me and giving me of just strength and courage. You see what I mean? Does that make sense? Okay. Any last minute thoughts, comments, questions before we take a pause and we break for Maghrib? And then we also end for today.
If you would like to listen to more, please donate to www.icnyu.org/donate. For more of our virtual programs, go to www.icnyu.org/classes. If you have any questions, email us at info@icnyu.org.